Last week we talked about parent functions. We talked about parent function of an absolute value function, a quadratic, and a cube, and also a square root. A parent function is just the very simplest form of that function. So if we're talking about the absolute value function, and that is written this way, y is equal to the absolute value of x, the graph of it starts at the origin, 0, 0, and the slope, there really is, nobody sees this, but there really is a 1 in front of here, and this basically is the slope of that graph. So the slope is 1, so I go up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, but also we go this way. So it's going to be, so this is my absolute value function. This is the graph. Now remember last week we said, well, what happens if we did the absolute value of x plus 2? Well, that's just going to shift the graph up 2 units. It's going to look exactly the same. It's going to have the exact same slope, but it's going to be shifted up 2 units. What if I put a number inside the absolute value function? It's going to move it left or right. So that's all the things that we talked about last week. So graphing absolute values, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time this week on it because we spent a lot of time last week dealing with it. The function f of x equals the absolute value of x is an absolute value function. The highest or lowest point on the graph of an absolute value function is called its vertex. An axis of symmetry of the graph of a function is a vertical line that divides the graph into mirror images. An absolute value graph has one axis symmetry that passes through the vertex. Okay, so if I had a graph, again, I have to turn on my marker again. If I had an absolute value graph that looked like this, the line of symmetry would be a vertical line that just goes straight through the vertex. Because if I folded it along that line, it should match up on the other side. That is what a line of symmetry is. It just, if you fold it on that line, it gives you a line of symmetry. Okay, so the translations, we talked about this last week. If we have a minus h here, it's going to move the graph to the right. If we have a k, it's going to plus k, it's going to move it up that many units. So these are all translations that we talked about last week. So graphing functions should be really easy. Now, when you put a number on the outside, that's just basically the slope. If I was going to graph this one, 2 times absolute value of x, well, now my slope is 2 instead of 1. So my graph, and I'm just going to do this real quick here. The normal graph has a slope of 1, so it looks something like this. But then if I put 2 in front of there, let's do green here, that means my slope is 2. Well, that goes up faster. So that means my absolute value graph would look more like this. Not a good. If it was 1/2, it would be, now my slope would be 1/2. Still is going to look like a V shape. It just, the slope is going to be different. So the number out in front is just going to change the slope of the graph. And you can, now the minus sign, we talked about that last week. If you have a negative in front, I'm going to flip. So that means this would be a line of symmetry, wouldn't it? If I had that graph and it flips it over, that would be the line of symmetry. All right, so that is graphing absolute value. So if I gave you a problem like this, I said, okay, it's your turn, and this is something that would be on the assessment this week. Graph the function y is equal to 2 times the absolute value of x plus 2 minus 3. Okay, so I start thinking about the problem, and the first thing I think about is, how is it going to be shifted left and right? Okay, so this one is going to shift it down 3 units. This one's going to shift it to the left. Okay, so left 2, down 3. So that's where I start. That's my vertex. So I'm going to go over 2, down 3. That's my vertex right here. Okay, my slope is going to be 2. So from this point, I go up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. Over 1, up 2, over 1, up 2, over 1, up 2, and this is now my graph. Now, how could I check to see if I'm correct? If I was going to do this, I'm just going to plug this into my calculator or and see if my graph looks right. And I will guarantee you that that is the correct graph, because I shifted over 2 places to the left, I shifted down 3 places, and my slope, this number is going to be my slope here. Slope is 2. All right, let's try some practice problems from this week. Here's a practice problem. It says, what is the vertex of f of x? Okay, so the vertex here So 1, 2, 3, down 5. So it looks like my vertex, oops, turn my marker on. One of these days I'll remember that. So my vertex looks like it's 3, -5. It looks like my vertex. And it says, is it a max or minimum value? Well, since it's the lowest point on the graph, it is a minimum value. So let's see which one matches up. 3, -5, minimum. Oh, letter B. Oh, solving absolute value equations. Okay. So when we solve an absolute value equation, most of the time we're going to get 2 answers. So if I gave you just a simplistic problem and I said, what is the absolute value of x equals 2? What's your solution? And a lot of people would say, well, my solution is 2. Well, that is incorrect. The solution is 2 or -2. Because if I put -2 in here, the absolute value of -2 is 2, because an absolute value takes away the negative sign. So how do we come up with 2 solutions when we solve an absolute value problem? Super simple, okay? What you have to do is, once you isolate the absolute value function, and what does that mean? Well, if you had something like the absolute value of x minus 4 is equal to 6, the absolute value function is not all by itself on the side of the equal sign. You've got a -4 here. You've got to get rid of that. Now, if there was a 2 in front of here, well, you'd have to get rid of the 4 and the 2 before you can rewrite the problem. What do I mean by rewrite the problem? Okay, so here's what I mean. Let me see if I can erase this stuff. I'm not sure. Clear annotations. So yes, clear them. Okay. So again, we'll start with a very simplistic problem that I had to start with. Absolute value of x equals 2. As soon as you get the problem down where the absolute value symbol is all by itself on one side and all the other numbers are on the other side, then you write it as 2 problems. You write it as x equals 2 or x equals the opposite of this number, which is -2. Now I don't have to do any more work because there was nothing inside the absolute value. So let's try a different problem. Let's try a harder one. So let's say I gave you something like the absolute value of x minus 4 is equal to 10. Well, now it's not all by, the absolute value is not all by itself. There's a 4 on this side. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides, just like I would solve any equation. And I'd end up with the absolute value of x is equal to 14. Now the absolute value symbol is by itself, so now I can rewrite it as x equals 14 or x equals -14. Pretty simple, right? Okay. So let's say I put a 2 in front here. Okay. I'd start the same way. I'm going to add 4 to both sides, so then I'd end up with 2 times absolute value of x equals 14. There's still a number that the absolute value symbol is not by itself, so I would divide through by 2 here, and I'd end up with x. I'd end up with the absolute value of x equals 7. So now I can rewrite it as x equals 7 or x equals -7. Okay, so that's a little bit tougher. Now the hardest type of problem that I can give you with absolute value problems is something that looks like this. Let's say I gave you 2 times absolute value of x plus 5 minus 2 is equal to, let's say, 10. Okay, so now I've got a lot of different numbers on here. Okay, so it's basically like solving an equation. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So I end up with 2, the absolute value of x plus 5 is equal to 12. And then I want to get rid of this number in front of the absolute value. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So now I have the absolute value of x plus 5 is equal to 6. Now, you cannot add or subtract a number that's inside the absolute value. You can't just subtract 5 from both sides. It doesn't work. So now my next step would be to rewrite the problem without the absolute value. I'm going to rewrite it as two separate problems. I'm going to rewrite it as x plus 5 is equal to 6, or x plus 5 is equal to negative 6. And see what I did? I rewrote it as a positive and a negative. And now if I solve, I'm just going to subtract 5 from both sides. So x equals 1. And then I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides here, or x equals negative 11. So a lot of students, as soon as they get an absolute value problem, they give me two answers that are exactly, they'll say 5 and negative 5, 6 or negative 6, 10 or negative 10. It doesn't always work. If there's a number on the inside of this absolute value symbol, up with two different, totally different numbers. But it's not difficult. You just have to remember the rules. You want to get rid of all of the numbers that are on the outside of the absolute value symbol, and then you rewrite it as two different problems, one with plus and one with negative, and then you solve. Okay, so that's a quick review of how to solve these types of problems, and here's some Avid notes where you can plug those, solve them for me. That would show me that you know what you're doing. Okay, and again, solve the equation. So if I had this problem right here, I'll solve it for you here. I've got 2, the absolute value of x minus 5 minus 4 is equal to 2. Okay, so I have to get rid of all the numbers that are on the outside of the absolute value symbol. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I end up with 2. The absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to 6. I'm going to divide through by 2 now. So I'm left with the absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to 3. So now I have all of the numbers on the outside of the absolute value gone. So I'm going to rewrite the problem. So that's when we rewrite it as two separate problems. So I've got x minus 5 equals 3, or x minus 5 equals negative 3. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. I end up with x equals 8, or add 5 to both sides, x equals 2. There's my answer. X equals 8 or x equals 2. Awesome. Love these types of problems, but you have to follow the steps in order to get them correct. Let's try a practice problem. So this is a practice problem from this week. So I've got the absolute value of x minus 3 is equal to 4. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I've got the absolute value of x. I'm going to add 3, so equals 7. And then if I rewrite it, I end up with x equals 7, or x equals negative 7. So I'm going to go with letter A here for my answer. And this one's a little bit harder. Okay. So I have 2. I'm going to do this a little weird here for you guys. I've got 2 minus, and I'm going to put a 1 in front of the absolute values because there's always a 1 here. 2x minus 5 equals 7. Okay. I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I'm left with negative 1. The absolute value of 2x minus 5 is equal to, what is that, 5? I'm going to divide through by negative 1. So I end up with 2x minus 5, the absolute value, is equal to 4. So now I can rewrite it as two separate problems because I have all of the numbers on the side. Oh, I'm sorry, this was a divide sign. This should be negative 5. Sorry about that. I was dividing by negative 1. Okay. So now this is an absolute value symbol, so I'm just going to rewrite this as two separate problems. So 2x minus 5 equals negative 5, or 2x minus 5 equals 5. Now, I know right away that my answer is going to be no solution. Why do I know that? Because I have an absolute value. What do we know about absolute values? They always are positive, right? So I'm looking at this, and it's like, how can the absolute value of something be negative 5? It can't. That means there is no solution to this problem. There's no way that that would work. And you can check yourself, because you could add 5 to both sides here, and you end up with 2x equals 0. Divide through by 2, x equals 0. So put 0 in here. 2 times 0 is 0 minus 5, so that gives you the absolute value of negative 5 equals negative 5. No, it doesn't. The absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. So that is not true. So I know it's not true. that is it for this week. I hope you guys learned a lot. Hopefully I'll see you on Monday from 10 to 11 at our main lesson. You guys have a great week. Bye.